coming. I know it's a beautiful day out and all that jazz, so I appreciate you being here. I've probably talked about this too many times in social situations. I forget to share it with you all. I also just want to say, just by being on a college campus, this is a topic that affects everybody, so if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. So, I'm going to first get started with whether or not this has been a couple years or if you're in it right now. What is one word you would use to describe the job or internship search process?
Oh.
Stressful.
Exhausting.
Exhausting.
Unknown.
Unknown.
Bleak.
Anxiety.
Also exciting.
Oh, true. Okay. That is probably the only positive word I've done. So we'll go with that. So I asked a handful of people that are mostly college seniors, just kind of trying to get a sense of what people are feeling, and these were some of the answers I got. Defeating, stressful, confusing, rejection, exhausting, pain in the ass, demoralizing, crapshoot.
Yeah.
Not a very happy list of words. And that kind of got me thinking of why, when we have very motivated, college-educated students, why are we struggling when it comes to finding a job post-grad? Especially when, during a lot of our time as students, we've been told, oh, just get a bachelor's degree, you'll be fine. So that was one question that started me thinking about this concept of higher education and having students get jobs after they graduate. And then I have a couple other personal motivation things that got me going. So the first one was between my junior and senior year when I was looking for an internship. And I ended up putting 17 internship applications out. I only had about 3 responses, and by responses I mean anything from yes to, hey, we looked at your application, and no. That was it. And that for me was kind of a wake-up call in terms of, is this a product of me? Is it a product of my education? Is it a product of the workforce that I'm trying to go into? Is it the competition that's around me? And something else that kind of woke me up to this idea was that I wasn't the only one feeling this. Pretty much everybody around me was having similar struggles in this process. I also had some conversations with people abroad. So I had a friend that I met in Argentina from Switzerland, and she was telling me about the vocational school program that system that Switzerland has. She was saying how in high school or even as early as middle school, there's a split, and some of the students go to vocational programs, some of them go to higher education. And she said, and it's not necessarily like people look down upon anybody who goes to these vocational programs. It's more that that's just a very natural divide. And so that got me thinking of, well, maybe if we can start to look at vocational programs as a system for trying to mend this process. Which brought me to the first part of my thesis, which was an econometric study. And I looked at a worldwide study trying to assess the relationship between youth unemployment and vocational school attendance. And unemployment, that does not include those who are in school, but it's those who are actively seeking employment. And it's those that are out of the labor force. And youth unemployment, it captured ages 15 to 24. And then the vocational school enrollment, that was a very vague, just a very vague, just a very vague key part of what I was looking for. And I measured it out of vocational school pupils divided by secondary school pupils. And what it said it measured was it was people who are in technical trainings, including teacher trainings, and that's kind of all it said. But I wanted to see if there's a relationship across all countries, trying to see if we can see this relationship. So I measured 154 countries from 1970 to 2017. And I had a variety of control variables, some including GDP per capita, economic freedom index, adult literacy percentage, women's social rights, just a variety of different control variables. And I'm not going to go too far into this just for the sake of time, but I am presenting tomorrow at CIRC, so if you're interested, I will be going more into this. But basically, I threw a lot of different variables in, had a lot of different thought behind, well, maybe this will start to control had country and year fixed effects trying to control for the differences in time. And every single time I brought it up, it was not statistically significant, which is really fun. And so I failed to reject my null hypothesis that there was a relationship between youth unemployment and vocational school percentage. And this really got me thinking of why is this, and it kind of brings me back to that vocational school, the vagueness of that indicator. And I was thinking that because that is such a vague term, we don't know if that means like in Switzerland, where it's you divide when you're in high school and you go down this track, or if it's something like here where we think, oh, it's maybe an apprenticeship, something like that. And so that really got me thinking about if we're trying to look for something in the US, something to try to mend this gap between academia and industry, then we really need to look at the United States in its own merit and on its own terms. And so that brought me to the rest of my paper, which was really looking at the United States in all of its history and its culture, in everything that is wrapped up into higher education and that affects why we see these struggles with students today. So to begin with that part, I'm going to give a brief history of higher education in the United States. And I want you to, while I'm going through this, to really be mindful of aspects that might be, that we might see today in terms of on our campus, in colleges, these aspects that are very ingrained into our society and into our culture. So there's 4 main models I'm going to talk about. The first is the monastic model, and it stemmed from in Western Europe in the 1300s, when education and formal schooling was done in monasteries and cathedrals, and really the main aspect of that was that it was detached from all worlds. It was something that was, they wanted to have an academic sphere that was detached from distractions like employment, and Oxford was the one that really broke from this, but they still wanted tradition, and so they still kind of kept with this idea. And that is kind of where it's this nickname of the ivory tower. So it's detached from all worlds, and it's definitely offered for white elite sons of very wealthy families. So where might this be today? Where might we see this model today? Yeah, Victoria.
I feel like private academies, really high level, expensive.
Yeah.
Even like high schools.
Yeah, for sure. So the one that came to mind for me was the Ivy League, Ivory Tower, Ivy League, that kind of thing. And the fact that there are these like very elite institutions, we see them as kind of like the pinnacle of higher education. And another aspect of the monastic model that I think we see today is the 4-year university. We are pretty much detached from all worlds when we're here. We're supposed to be on kind of this pedestal of learning and learning just for learning's sake, not necessarily for the sake of bringing it to society and to the career. I'll get into that. I don't mean that like as an all catch-all, but. So the next model is the polytechnic model, and this came with the division, so the Morrill Act, and with private Morrill Act created these land-grant institutions, and then there was a division where there was private universities and land-grant institutions. And land-grant institutions definitely focused on agriculture and mechanics. They're kind of known as the A&M schools today. And private universities, they really wanted to shift toward public welfare. There's a specialization, so majors started forming, and there was like this really focus on research. And so we see that there's still that idea of like this exclusive academic sense, but it was a shift more towards this public welfare specializing, trying to connect it more into society. And a word that I'm going to use a lot throughout this presentation is academic exclusivity, and it's kind of this idea that we're in this higher up academic sphere. And one thing that definitely started emerging during this time, kind of stemming from the monastic model, was this social class division. So land-grant institutions were definitely reserved for people who wanted to be in agriculture or mechanics, and so people who were typically in lower social classes. And then these private universities were more reserved for people who wanted this more elite academic model. This then shifted after World War II when the GI Bill was passed, and there was this massive influx of veterans that were coming back that were wanted to be educated. And so the GI Bill was passed, and all of a sudden these institutions were struggling trying to fill this influx in demand. And so they turned to the Industrial Revolution model of like massification and like assembly line. And so it was trying to get people in and out pretty quickly. And that model had never been done in a Western country. And it was definitely looked down upon of people who were part of kind of this academic exclusive group, because it was fast, it was quick, it was to the point, and it didn't really get to this idea of what people wanted in terms of really diving into learning for learning's sake. And this also came the emergence of community colleges, but again, these community colleges were reserved for veterans and were reserved for people who came back. And so when community colleges started coming around, again, there's this social division. And I think we can see that today. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that there's still a division between community colleges and private universities and social class division. So the last big model that I'm going to talk about, and I think this is still very present today in higher education. There's many aspects that are throughout these models, but this is the one that I see a lot of. So when the baby boom generation started graduating, there was this generation called the baby bust, and it was significantly smaller than the baby boom. And so all of a sudden, the universities were struggling to fill all of these spots that they had. So they wanted to try to revamp their advertising model, try to create a system that got people in. And so they started selling this lifestyle model. So they were selling a lifestyle, and that meant that you could come live on a fancy dorm and go and eat in a mess hall, and there was a gym nearby. And so all of these new facilities started coming up, which created these kind of communities of campuses. And the magazine revolution, where people were kind of obsessed with higher education and colleges. And because of all of this, there were a couple different reasons why tuition started skyrocketing. One, because you have to pay for all those fancy things. And two, because, there was another reason, because the government started subsidizing higher education through the GI Bill, institutions could start raising their prices more. And then there was also this idea of exclusivity. So if you make an institution more expensive, it's all of a sudden a lot more exclusive, because you have people who are there just because they're willing and able to spend the money on it. And I do think that we see that today in terms of, I don't know if anybody else remembers the 20 million pamphlets you got in the mail when we were all looking at colleges. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, trying to sell it to the lifestyle to the student. So that is a general history of higher education, and we can see that it definitely changes. There's an influx, but I think something that I noticed between all four models was that there is definitely a social class division present in all of them. There's this idea of academia for academia's sake, and there's this idea of going to college in order to further a career. And that's something that I really want to specify, because it's pretty much the entire crux of the argument. So I also wanted to talk about education as a private and as a public good. This is something that came up a lot in terms of these ideas of learning and academic exclusivity, but also trying to get a career. And I think it's really important to notice that on both ends of the spectrum, you can kind of fit them into both models. So private good, it's going to school to better yourself, and that can be seen as as a person. So that can be kind of included in this academic exclusive model of, oh, you're learning for learning's sake, you are bettering yourself as a person, but it can also be seen as a potential employee. So you are trying to go to school to get a degree to be able to be more marketable in the labor force. Education can also be seen as a public good, so it's the betterment of society. where you can become more socially engaged. And again, that's kind of that idea of if you can, be involved in global leadership or something like that, you're more socially engaged. So that might be part of what this academic exclusive model is saying. But it also demands that you understand the needs of society, meaning that you understand what the labor force is demanding, you understand the type of skills that you need to be able to be in the labor force. And something that I think is really important is that externalities kind of blend these two together. So externalities is a term that we use a lot in economics. It's basically the consequences it's either the positive or negative consequences of consuming a good that goes out to other people. So like outside of education, a good example of this is vaccination. You typically don't go get a vaccine because you want to help everybody else around you, but that's just a positive externality of going and getting that vaccine. So in education, this is the kind of thing that I think can help blend these two together, and I'm trying to really merge a lot of these things together because I think they're more similar than we lead on. So I think that you can go to college and you can better yourself, but you can better yourself in order to better society. And I think that in order to is the really important part of bringing public and private good together. So with those two ideas of public and private good as these ideas of education, there emerges two main purposes of higher education. And the first one is this idea of meaning making. So it's again this idea of growing as a whole person, of being invested in self-reflection and self-discernment, and really figuring out what your purpose and your meaning is in life. And a really interesting aspect of meaning making is that it requires that institutions aid in this process. So it demands that colleges should aid in the process of meaning making, should aid in the process of finding your purpose. That should be one of the intentional purposes of higher education, is really finding your purpose. And I think again, this is part of that social division point because some people might not have the accessibility to go to a college that has this purpose in mind. But another interesting aspect of meaning making is that it criticizes colleges who are only there to prepare you for work and for the career. And I think this idea might be a little familiar. I don't know if we've heard about it before, but I think this is something that came up where I was like, this is definitely a Jesuit Gonzaga ideal of building and growing as a whole person, and of being socially engaged and of being aware of what your purpose is in the world. And the other juxtaposing purpose of higher education is this career preparation. And I think what's so interesting about these two is that they are put on such different platforms. And I think that it's really interesting because a lot of institutions do value both. But if you look at Gonzaga's mission statement, for example, career preparation isn't in there all that much, where it's a lot of cura personalis, growing the whole person, being socially engaged. So I think it is interesting that these are such separate ideas. So by career preparation, I really mean like this idea of academic capitalism, being marketable for the job force. And I think another interesting thing about career preparation is sometimes it might not be the institution's main purpose, but it might be a student's main purpose for going to college. So if a student is intending, I want to go to college so I can get a degree, so I can be marketable when I leave and when I graduate, but the institution doesn't have that purpose as high of a factor in mind, then that's why I think a lot of students end up looking for summer internships, end up involving themselves in career networking events or things of that nature. And this is not to say that Gonzaga doesn't do this, because I do think Gonzaga does have a lot of career preparation tools available for us. But I do think it's interesting that when you're looking at these private higher up institutions, it might not be as big of a factor as we would expect. So there are two main ideas we see here. We see what employees are demanding, and we see what universities, and by universities I typically mean these private universities, kind of academic using that term, what universities are typically looking for meaning making and for building as whole people. So employees, the most things that employees are looking for, the first one is cognitive skills, and that includes reflecting, learning, processing, being able to debate between controversial topics, and the ability to learn from experience. And I think what's really interesting about cognitive skills is that it includes this synthesizing, processing, reflecting nature of it. And reflection is a huge part of meaning making. We can't decide what we're going to do with our lives. We can't find purpose in our lives if we don't have the skill of reflection. And then another aspect that employees are looking for are interpersonal skills. So that's communication, like verbal, written communication, but also empathy and anger management. And that's another thing that I think is really interesting when you think about the purpose of meaning making, because meaning making requires that you have multiple perspectives, that you see your place in the world, that you can empathize with other people, that you can see things from multiple perspectives, and that requires a lot of interpersonal skills. And then the other aspect that most employers are looking for is motivation. And this is really interesting because the U.S. currently has the highest college dropout rate in the world. And a huge aspect of that is that people are not seeing a connection between their studies and opportunities in the labor market. They're not seeing an investment payout. And so when you hear a lot of the time, are we ever going to use this? Ever? That's a lot of the reason, is people are not seeing that connection between the two. And so I think by providing that motivation, we can hopefully help to lower that dropout rate. So my big overall arching thesis statement argument is that experiential learning can help bridge the gap between these two. It gets people out into the workforce. It allows them to experience a lot of what employees are looking for, to connect on a lot of these things, but it does not stray away from meaning making. It does not stray away from these ideas that universities, and especially in our culture, elite universities, have labeled as important purposes of higher education. So experiential learning, there's many aspects to it, and I've narrowed it down to 4 key aspects of what makes a successful experiential learning experience. And the first one is that experiential learning, not only does it help for employers and help get students into job markets, but it is also helpful for engaging students in the classroom. And there's been many studies done about this, and I think that it's interesting that a lot of the studies were saying it has significant impact on student success. So it's not just impact on getting them a job, but it's impact on being successful in the classroom. And I think it's something that can be a component of curricula for all disciplines and all majors. I think we see some of experiential learning in terms of nursing or in terms of student teaching, especially on Gonzaga's campus, but it's not necessarily a component in many other disciplines. It's typically reserved for more technical degrees. So the aspects of experiential learning that are necessary is one, a very strong partnership between the employers and the faculty members. And this is something that seems like it might be difficult because typically employers leave the young adult development to the teachers, as we've seen in the past, but I do think it's something that it has benefits for everybody. So one really important aspect of experiential learning is that it is on-the-job training before graduation. So employers can invest in students and have on-the-job training, and it's before they even graduate. So by the time they graduate, they're not as far behind, and they don't have to spend 2 years actually investing in those employees. The other thing is that they can pay them, but they can pay them at a much lower rate because they are more willing to do it. And so for students, that helps because it helps them to make some money, but for employers, it really helps because they can get access to developing professionals, but at a much lower financial rate. And the other aspect about these partnerships that's really important is the fact that in the age of such huge technological advances, it's important to connect these two, because otherwise we have students who are graduating and are now 4 years behind the technology advances and can't be as engaged as they could be. So bringing that technology to campus, bringing that technology, connecting the faculty so that they can build their curriculum around what the employers are needing, and employers can help to build that curriculum is a really important aspect. Supervisors is another really important aspect of experiential learning, and actually probably one of the most important aspects, because sometimes we see the stereotypical internship where you're making copies or you're getting coffee. That's not what I'm talking about. And so I think having supervisors on both ends is really important. There was an article I read that had supervision broken down into 3 aspects. It had either supervision from employers, supervision from faculty members, or a cohort of supervisors from both. And it didn't say necessarily which one was the most effective, but I do believe that having some supervisors in both, again, helps to foster that partnership, but also helps to provide that supervision on both ends. And then they also get to stake claim in the curriculum and the experiential learning activities. So teachers can go in and say, well, this is what we're learning. How do we need to tweak this maybe to fit what you need as an employer? And employers both can have claim in it. And the other aspect of experiential learning that's incredibly important is reflection. And this was something that actually really surprised me, because I didn't expect that to be such an aspect of the workforce. I think I expected it to be much more of an aspect of institutions and higher education. But reflection allows people to process, to be kind of involved in that self-discernment, but also to connect their studies back to their learning experiences. And so they're able to then discuss these experiences in an interview and be able to connect, oh, I had this experience when I was working with an employer, and this is what it meant. And then it also aids in, again, this meaning-making process of being involved and really thinking about what you want to do and what's your purpose. So I have a couple policy recommendations for implementing this. And first and foremost is that there needs to be more flexibility and adaptability at the local level than at the federal. So I think the biggest thing that federal policy can do is to provide that flexibility at the local level, because it is about the partnership between the local employers and the institutions. And I have many examples, and I didn't put them up there, but federal policy in regards to this has not worked many times. So I think really giving the local level the ability to say, is this best done through a nonprofit? Is this best done through partnerships between employers that we know on campus? Really giving that flexibility and that adaptability, I think, is really important. I also think federal policy can help in terms of providing incentives. So whether that's giving tax breaks to employers who are more involved with universities and have more of that partnership, or if it's still providing different scholarships or something to universities that really get involved some way or another, providing those incentives. I also think that the policy recommendations, and this is not all just my thoughts, these are many other people's thoughts, but the accreditation assessment, so providing a sort of quality assurance assessment, saying how is this working, how are our students connecting in these experiential learning opportunities, and then also providing thorough credentials that are recognized across many different disciplines. So whether or not that looks like graduating with a degree and then having some sort of experiential learning certificate, or if it morphs more into where the degree really does encompass that experiential learning aspect, is really important. And this is being done. It's not just happening in my head. So the Metro State University in Denver opened up a new aerospace and engineered sciences building, I believe in 2016. And what's really interesting about this building is they are bringing industry, technology, and employers on campus. So they're partnering with people like Lockheed Martin, United Airlines, and they're bringing a lot of these tools onto campus. So students are getting these experiences with this kind of technology and with these employers in their classes. And it really just, it brings it into the classroom, and so it's not as foreign as it might seem when people actually graduate. And then you're also making those connections with employers. So if employers are saying, oh, I have an entry-level job I need to fill, but I've been in this classroom day in, day out with these students, then they can contact them and hopefully hire them. Northeastern University in Boston has a program called Experiential Network, and they offer 6-week 4-credit courses working with nonprofits and for-profits, and this is across many different disciplines. And that was a really interesting one because it's, again, part of the curriculum. They're connecting people with these industries and having them work on projects, but it was across many different disciplines. It wasn't just like these tech or aerospace sciences type things. It was definitely across businesses, across nonprofits. So it included a lot of different students and a lot of different things. Spring Theory, which their little icon is down there, is a matchmaking service between universities and industry stakeholders. And this was a really interesting one because they connect, they first go to institutions and talk to them about what is the kind of curriculum you're putting out, and then they go to companies and say what is the kind of tools you're needing, and they connect them together, and they start to bring those two together. And some of the different companies that they've been working with are NFL, AT&T, JetBlue, and some of the universities are University of San Francisco, University of Chicago, and Columbia. So these aren't, I bring those examples up because especially some of those universities, they're not universities that we would typically associate with technical degrees or community colleges. It's definitely universities that are high up there that I think I would typically categorize as private, sort of part of this academia for academia's sake universities, and they're seeing that this is definitely a need. And another example that I didn't actually write about in my paper, but I worked with last summer, is called Quad Innovation Partnerships in Colorado Springs. And they have different partnerships that they work with. So they work with 4 different universities in Colorado Springs. 2 of them are, well, one of them is a community college, one is a state school, one is a private university, and one is the Air Force Academy. And they bring all of those universities together, and they bring the students together to work on these projects in the community. And they usually assign it as a summer internship or an internship during the school year. And they're connecting them with community members, hoping to kind of keep students in Colorado Springs, to keep them connected, but also to give them those experiences in the workforce before graduation. And as I try to create cultural change in 40 minutes, I think the big thing that I want to emphasize on this is that it's not taking something like the German vocational model and plopping it down in the United States and hoping it'll work. Something about this experiential learning shows that it works within the culture of higher education because we are a culture of higher education. And that's definitely something that, at least for me, when I was looking at colleges, it wasn't if I was going to college, it was where I was going to college. And so I think that's something that we need to work within. It's not something that we can just remodel without working with it step by step. And so I think something that I read a lot about creating cultural change is that it happens with these incremental steps. And so I do think that if we try to implement something like experiential learning, it starts to even the playing field between these technical colleges and these private universities, because it brings experiential learning into the classroom at every level. And I think once that playing field is more even, then it might be able to trickle down into more high schools or middle schools where it might be more acceptable to go to a technical college if you don't want a lot of what these private universities are offering. But I don't think that that's something that we can just implement right off the bat, and before we have the time to really work within that culture. And I think like there's a program in Spokane called T24, and one of the articles that I actually pulled and wrote a lot on was saying that we need to really divide. Now we need to divide in high schools or middle schools and have some kids go into vocational tracks, have some kids go into higher education. And I do believe that eventually that's probably the best way to go. But again, I think that there's such a social class division and there's such a prejudice against not going to college, that working within that higher education model and kind of bringing them on a even playing field is the best method to go. So this is my humble attempt to try to explain some of the differences in higher education and the cultural implications that come with working within education reform. And that's all I got.